I will be ranking the performance of every major PC game in 2023 into a tier list. So,
grab your popcorn, sit back and relax.
Because this will be extensive. The best optimized games will be in S tier, while worse optimized games will be lower in ranking, reaching F tier. I have played most of the games on this list, and the rankings will reflect my experience of their PC performance, while the rankings of the ones that I haven't personally played will be based on the performance benchmarks and videos from the community. A game's performance optimization score is influenced by several factors. Here's what a very well optimized game should include. Reasonable hardware requirements for a game's graphics and performance. Its graphics should justify its performance. How well it utilizes the hardware, ensuring no part is left underutilized. Frame rate and frame time stability. There should be no unexplained drops or stuttering. No constant or frequent crashes. A meaningful amount of graphic settings and options. Reasonably fast loading times. Updates and patches that continuously improve performance will also influence the final score. These factors are crucial in determining a game's performance optimization in my opinion. So, let's begin. Starting in order of release date. The first major PC game to be released in 2023 was FORSPOKEN, and oh my, what a mess. For a next-gen game, it looked terrible, it performed terribly, and even the dialogue and gameplay was terrible. It somehow managed to get a hat trick in the worst qualities of a game. Sure, it got a few updates that slightly improved the game a little afterwards, but still, no one wants to touch it with a 10-foot pole. Now, for its optimization. At launch, I would have put it in tier F, but after the updates, I'm still gonna put it in tier F. Next is Dead Space Remake, which was just a little bit more demanding than it looked. It only had a few settings to change, making it not really scalable. Plus, it had frequent stuttering and FPS drops that weren't really justifiable. It needed better optimization before release. I'm being generous by putting it in tier E. Next is Hogwarts Legacy, a big disappointment in optimization. The game's frame rate is all over the place, especially in Hogsmeade, where it still dips way too low, even with the best of CPUs. The performance there is barely scalable, forcing most people to play at lower frame rates, even if they had the best of the best hardware. It also suffered from noticeable stuttering and hitching across the entire game. The game doesn't even look that good for how demanding it is. I will put it in tier F. If it wasn't for the constant stuttering, I would have put it in tier E. Next is Returnal. The game ran generally well, but it had limited scalability, and it was extremely GPU heavy for how it looked. Therefore, most people had lower FPS than they hoped for a game of its size and scope. The game also barely used the CPU, as it was not CPU demanding. I would have preferred if the devs moved some parts of the rendering from the GPU to the CPU to more evenly balance the game's hardware utilization, which would have allowed for higher frame rates when GPU limited, which was 100% of the time on my system. I will put it in tier D. Next is one of the most forgettable games of 2023, Wild Hearts. I originally planned to make an optimization guide for it, but as soon as I tried it, I noticed that it ran like absolute dog shit. No offense to dogs, or shit. And when I was changing settings, there was barely a 10% FPS difference between the lowest and maximum settings, which is why I don't have an optimization guide for it. I will put it in tier F. Next is Atomic Heart. The game initially heavily promoted ray tracing, but launched without it. And so far, it never added ray tracing via an update. The game looked good, but there was nothing really special about it. It wasn't an open world, but instead it was divided into multiple open-ended levels. It mostly ran just as one would expect, but I expected slightly higher performance at times. It properly implemented shader compilation before loading a level, so it didn't have any stuttering related to that. I will put it in tier C. Moving on to Sons of the Forest. The game is so demanding, it's absurd. It's very GPU heavy for its graphics, and it still has popping issues at low distances like the first game. This game rightly goes into tier E. Next came Wo Long Fallen Dynasty, which looked like a PS3 game and ran like crap. It felt clunky and it was genuinely painful testing it, so I chose not to make an optimization guide for it. I will be generous and put it into tier E. After that disaster came a game beloved to most, if not all of us, Resident Evil 4 Remake. It was genuinely a step up in terms of overall graphics and textural polish over Resident Evil Village. It ran well for how it looked, with only a couple of major CPU related FPS drops in specific areas in my entire playthrough on my RTX 3060 and R5 3600X. In those scenarios, the game was CPU limited and averaged 40 to 50 FPS, which is unacceptable for a game of its scope. Other than that, it ran well, but it lacked support for DLSS, which I wanted to use specifically in that game. I will put it in tier C. I honestly expected a little bit better optimization from it. Moving on to one of the most controversial PC ports of 2023, The Last of Us Part 1. When it launched, it had terrible performance. It was extremely CPU and GPU limited, and the game hogged VRAM to the point where anything below a 12GB GPU couldn't handle the game properly, even at lower texture settings. Thankfully, the game received constant updates, which I covered on the channel. These updates gradually improved performance, lowered VRAM usage, added more settings, and optimized the texture quality options to look better and use less VRAM at the same time. If we're talking about the performance of the game at launch, I would have put it into tier E or F, but since the game has improved a lot throughout the updates, I will put it in tier D. I only wish it was less CPU intensive still after all these updates. The next game is Dead Island 2, finally launching after years of delays. I was surprised when it was announced that the game wouldn't be an open world, but instead would be cut off into smaller closed off levels. It felt like the game would have benefited from being an open world. In the end, that decision reflected the game's performance, since the game averaged higher frame rates than other similar games generally do. It ran great, it looked okay, but honestly, it was still missing something more, graphically speaking. I will put this game in tier A and not tier S, only because it felt like the game could have supported ray tracing and even DLSS. Next up is Star Wars Jedi Survivor, an infamous PC port. It launched with terrible performance, being CPU limited at low frame rates and constantly stuttering. But after many patches, performance actually noticeably improved, but the game still stutters. At launch, I would have put it in tier F, but after the updates, I'm gonna put it in tier E. The next game is REDFALL. It flopped so hard in every aspect, so let's make this quick. The game ran worse than expected. It looked below average. It stuttered constantly. It's basically not well optimized. I will put it in tier E. Moving on to another infamous game, Lord of the Rings GOLLUM. I don't think anyone would classify it as a major game, but honestly, I just wanna have some fun mocking it. It looks like a PS3 game that looked like a PS2 game. It ran poorly, but not the worst I've seen. But considering how it looks, I would say poorly is too generous. What's even worse is the constant stuttering, which is why I can safely put it in tier F. The next game is Street Fighter 6. I tried it for a while. It looked okay, it ran well, it isn't demanding, and I didn't even see the need for an optimization guide. I will put it in tier A. Now for Diablo 4. It ran well for how it looked, and it wasn't demanding, although it suffered from some stutters here and there. It was a breath of fresh air after those last few terrible PC ports for sure. I will put it in tier A. Next up is Remnant 2, which technically has a lot going on, but artistically looked bland and dull most of the time. It ran very poorly and suffered a needless CPU bottleneck at lower frame rates, which was unacceptable for its game scope. Its few settings were not that scalable, and the game only looked acceptable when you turned on upscaling. Otherwise, you would get a lot of visual artifacts, which made it clear that the game was designed to be used with upscaling in mind. The game received its first patch, and after I covered it, it noticeably increased the GPU performance, but CPU performance was still the main issue. Even after the updates, I'm gonna put it in tier E. The next game is Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart. It looked great and ran decently, but I found it to be a bit too demanding in terms of GPU performance. It's understandable, but still, it properly benefited from ray tracing in Reflections, and I found the DLSS implementation to be very good in this game. I will put it in tier B. Let's move on to Baldur's Gate 3, one of the best games, if not the best game of 2023, at least according to me. However, its performance is a whole other story. This game is notorious for being extremely CPU heavy. The frame rate took a hit, especially in the third act in Baldur's Gate City, where at launch it was almost unplayable for most people. But thankfully, the game received regular updates, some of which improved CPU performance noticeably. At launch, I would have put it into tier F, but after the updates and the improved performance, I will put it in tier D. The next game is Immortals of AVEUM, another Forspoken disaster, but in first person. The game somehow manages to perform worse than Forspoken while being slightly less worse looking. It's extremely demanding with no beneficial visual reason. It's one of those games that are technically demanding but artistically bland. Whatever frame rate you think your PC can achieve, divide that by 2 and subtract 10. That's how much FPS you will get. I will put it in tier F. Next up is Starfield. What can I say? It's supposed to be a next-gen game, but it looks like it competes with PS3 era games, and performance is memorable in the worst way possible. It manages to have terrible optimization and scaling. You'll get sub 30 FPS on budget systems, while getting 60 FPS will make your wallet cry. And all systems will have traversal stutter as a bonus. It received an update that slightly improved performance, but it was unimpactful and definitely way too late. This one obviously goes into tier F. Moving on to the Crew MOTORFEST. The game is capped at 60 FPS for some reason. The graphics look decent, although the mirrors on cars don't cast real-time reflections, which is crucial for a racing game in 2023. The game runs decently well with nothing special to note. I would classify it as a non-demanding game that's fair in terms of performance and graphics, simply average. I will put it in tier C. Next is Lies of P, and I am delighted to say that this game has one of the highest frame rates in any PC game in 2023. It looks very good, especially its art style, and even better is the performance. Expect over 100 FPS on most budget systems. That's with the game's ultra settings, by the way. And if you still have an older GPU like the GTX 1060 or the RX 580, you can expect to get 60 FPS on high settings. This game seriously impressed me, and for that, I will gladly put it in tier S. Afterwards came Mortal Kombat 1, the best looking fighting game, period. It even looks better than Tekken 8, which hasn't even released yet. The game is definitely heavy to run, requiring crazy powerful GPUs, but considering its visuals, it's understandable. The game also seamlessly loads levels within a couple seconds after selecting a character, virtually eliminating the need for loading screens. If only its performance was a little better, I would have been more content with the port. I will put it in tier C. The next game to release was Payday 3. It moved to a new engine, but still looked basic. Even worse was the performance. The frame rates were quite low for its visuals, and it had constant stuttering issues. This game definitely wasn't optimized properly. Therefore, I will put it in tier E. Next in line is Cyberpunk 2077 Phantom Liberty. Technically, it's not a new game release, but only an expansion as well as a major update to the base game, which is why I wanted to include it in this list, as I felt that the game finally came out of unofficial early access. Performance-wise, the update had a lot of mixed reception, but on my system, performance actually seemed to improve, especially CPU performance. It seemed that they added a new setting that better utilized AMD Ryzen CPUs, which is what I had. Therefore, CPU performance was noticeably improved. But moving on to the Phantom Liberty expansion, oddly enough, there were a lot of areas where performance was noticeably worse than the base game, for no apparent reason. I ran into a lot of unexplainable CPU bottlenecks at low frame rates, to the point where it turned me off from wanting to start playing the game because performance was dropping so much in comparison to the base game. The expansion is definitely not well optimized. If only there wasn't such a big disparity between the expansion and the base game, I would have rated it higher. I will put Cyberpunk 2077 Phantom Liberty in tier E, but the base game will go in tier D. Next up was Counter-Strike 2, which took way too long to come out. It was surprisingly very GPU heavy and had a few settings to adjust, but they were meaningful. The only problem I had with its performance was that it had very low 1 percentile FPS, where no matter what settings you chose, it remained relatively the same. Given that, I will have to put it into tier B. The next game to come out was Assassin's Creed Mirage. It aimed to be a back to the roots title. Therefore, the world was smaller and more compact than previous titles, but it still had large open areas, so it kind of felt like both the older and newer games at the same time. And performance-wise, it ran just as I would expect, not any better or worse. It was an average game through and through, and it wasn't CPU bottlenecked at lower than 60 FPS on the R5 3600X, which meant you could get 60 FPS locked 99% of the time with modest hardware. I will put this game in tier B. Then came Forza Motorsport, a game that got heavily downgraded and released in such a messed up state that I refused to make an optimization guide for it. The settings menu was a complete disaster. It was incomprehensible for a lot of the player base. The graphics had a big disparity depending on the track. The cars looked noticeably worse than Forza Horizon 5. It ran okay, but I, as most people, expected better. Honestly, this game had a lot of potential, but what a disappointment. I will put it in tier D. Afterwards came Lords of the Fallen, a game that looks alright, but runs like crap. This game is way too demanding for how it looks, to the point where I refuse to make an optimization guide for it, because no matter what settings you chose, you will have terrible performance. It constantly received updates that were meaningless to performance, as it didn't improve. I will put it in tier F. Speaking of terrible performance, the next game to release was Cities: Skylines 2. I mean, do I even have to say what's wrong with this game? I guess I have to, since it's the point of this video. Well, if you've been living under a rock, the game's frame rate averages in the 10s to 20s in populated cities for all PCs. It's just incredibly unoptimized. They released patches afterwards that didn't really help with performance, but the last one before the end of the year increased performance by around 25 to 30% on average. I was originally gonna put this game in tier F, but after that patch, I will put it in tier E. It just missed tier F. Such lucky timing, devs, bravo. Alan Wake 2 released and everyone was quite shocked at just how demanding it was. To this day, it's still one of the most demanding games I have tested, justifiably so, because it's one of the best looking games that have ever released. And forget about turning on ray tracing in this game, because rasterization alone will make your GPU melt. Some of you might disagree, but honestly, this is a case where performance is justified by graphics. Although I have encountered areas with way too many FPS drops. I guess they should have better quality assurance tests for performance. Because of this, I will put this game in tier C. Next on the list was ROBOCOP Rogue City, another extremely demanding title. The game had a low budget look and feel to it, but it had its own charm. Performance was very low for the graphics it offered. I feel like the game could have easily been better optimized. The game quickly received a few updates after launch that increased the number of lacking graphic settings so users could better tweak the game, and I personally found that to be a little helpful, but it still wasn't really enough. I will put this game in tier D. The next game is Avatar: Frontiers of Pandora, a game with truly breathtaking graphics. It made me want to just stop and take in the scenes. It's the most lush and dense game with incredible minute details that I have ever witnessed. And performance-wise, it obviously wrecks any system out there. I would say it's generally justified, except for a few things that I would like to point out. The game's reflections are subpar, especially because it uses ray tracing. The shadows have clearly visible stair-stepping to them. Some pop-in can be very noticeable. Clouds look shimmery and outdated. Nighttime looks very blurry and just plain doesn't look and feel right. Given these issues, I would like to put Avatar: Frontiers of Pandora in tier D. Otherwise, it would have gone straight to tier C. Next up is the finals. It released overnight and surprised us all. To be honest, I tried it and didn't really see what all the fuss was about. But anyway, performance-wise, it ran just as I expected, and that's with everything maxed out, including DLAA and maxed out ray tracing. I will put it in tier B. So let's check out all the rankings and see how they fare. Looks like this year we've got a lot of bad and below average PC ports. In fact, the majority of the PC ports this year were below average. This just goes to show you just how rare well-optimized PC games are, and just how common terrible PC ports are. In fact, the most optimized PC game of this year was actually a hidden gem. It's relatively unknown, which is Lies of P. Tell me down in the comments below if you've actually played this game or not, or if it was even on your radar. Looking at the overall picture, it seems to me that most below average all the way to the terrible PC ports of this year were mostly next gen or using next gen tech. However, the more better optimized games of this year were in fact not using these so-called next gen features. Mostly. I actually think we've got ourselves a long way to go until these so-called next-gen features become performant enough on our hardware and the devs better optimize them. Tell me what you think in the comments below. And if this video gets a lot of views, likes and shares, I will make another one next year.